The problem is that words do not always mean what we want them to mean, and do not always retain their meaning, even when we think we know what they are. And I'm often in a state of complete confusion. And so if you want clarity, well, I don't know. I can speak, no matter how vehemently I insist on what I choose to talk about, on the words I choose, those words are changing, and the definitions that I believe I know may be different tomorrow to what I think they are today. Words are revised, reversed, redefined, reappropriated. Words are constantly in a state of flux, rather like Heraclitus says, you can't step in the same river twice. Words which, I was looking at this rather brilliant book here, words which caused serious problems and and were the subject of criminal charges are now considered vapid and rather insignificant. You can go back to the D.H. Lawrence Lady Chatterley's lover trial, small fry today, and so with that in mind, I think it's worth looking at the idea of the BBC's impartiality, and if you look at the allegations made against the BBC about its bias, the BBC was accused of being overtly critical of the British government's stance on the Iraq War, for example, leading to the Hutton inquiry. The inquiry examined the death of Dr. David Kelly, the weapons expert who'd questioned the government's claims about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, who then apparently committed suicide, but whose finger prints were not found on the items that apparently led to his death. Andrew Gilligan's report on the Today programme suggested the government had sexed up the intelligence dossier of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, leading to accusations of bias against the BBC. In the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, during the lead-up to the referendum, the BBC faced accusations of bias both from supporters and opponents of the Scottish independence process, and some claim the BBC favoured the Better Together campaign. The Scottish National Party and the Yes campaigners argued the BBC's coverage was disproportionately negative towards independence, citing instances of unbalanced reporting and a lack of coverage by pro-independence arguments. The Brexit coverage, similarly, the BBC was accused of being pro-Brexit and anti-Brexit at the different times, reflecting the deeply divided public opinion. And as it was confirmation bias, effectively. Leavers accused the BBC of focusing too much on the negative economic forecasts and the perspectives of Remain supporters, while Remainers claimed the BBC gave undue prominence to Leave campaigners and the misleading information that seemed to be dogging their campaign and the sides of their buses. But there are instances of impartiality. So during general election campaigns, the BBC is scrupulous to maintain a balanced coverage. In the 2019 election, for example, the BBC aired debates featuring leaders from all the major parties, as it did in the 2024 campaign, with its political programmes such as Question Time hosting a range of political voices and personalities. In the Middle East conflict, the BBC has made efforts to provide balanced coverage of Middle East events, pulling back from calling people terrorists despite government pressure, presenting perspectives from both Israeli and Palestinian viewpoints. Its in-depth reporting and its documentaries on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict often include interviews with individuals and leaders from both sides, as well as analyses from various academic experts. Climate change is another area, though I think finally the BBC has come to the conclusion that climate change exists. And this has to be put into the context of a concept of impartiality, which interpreted by the BBC as foundational to its role as a public broadcaster, and impartiality refers to the principle of not showing bias or favouritism towards any side, maintaining its balance and objective approach in reporting. But the problem is words change their meaning, and identities change their meaning, particularly with hindsight. And the word impartial comes from the Latin word impartialis, which is a combination of the late Latin word, which is a combination of the Latin prefix im, meaning not, and partialis, meaning partial or biased. Partialis itself comes from pars, meaning a part, therefore not favouring a particular part, a particular group. And so being impartial is avoiding favouritism, treating all sides fairly. But it's not quite the same as neutrality. Neutrality is different to impartiality. And it's a different concept. The impartiality of the BBC is a different concept to the impartiality that you would find in a courtroom, for example, or in journalism, scientific research. These are different concepts of impartiality. They're understood differently. I think the BBC tends to take impartiality in terms of a political objection, a political stand against the ruling government of the time. Because every single government, certainly in my lifetime, has complained about the BBC's bias against it. The BBC's Royal Charter, first granted in 1927, emphasises impartiality. It emphasises due impartiality. I don't understand what the word due means in that context. I don't understand the difference between impartiality and due impartiality. The Charter mandated the BBC to provide information, education and entertainment with that impartiality built in, ensuring that all its services are delivered free from both political and commercial influence, and that controversial subjects are treated with due accuracy and impartiality. Due impartiality, due accuracy. Again, I don't understand what the word due means. When it comes to the big events in the BBC's life, World War II, the BBC was a crucial source of news and propaganda. Of course, the word propaganda has a negative meaning today, but it didn't originally. It simply was the noun from to propagate. Again, late Latin, and it was the idea of the Catholic Church disseminating its teachings. So therefore a good idea. It became a bad concept under the Soviet Union. And while the BBC aimed to provide accurate information, it also served as the government's interests by boosting morale and providing information supportive of the war effort. Despite this, the BBC maintained a reputation for accuracy, which was essential for its credibility, and it was often listened to by people in Germany, by people in France, by people in India, who wanted an uncritical, a factual account that they could believe. In the Cold War, impartiality took on a more nuanced term, and the BBC had to navigate reporting on communist states and tensions between the Eastern Bloc and the West. And in a way, it's doing that again now with wonderful people like Steve Rosenberg, putting out his remarkably brilliant reviews of life in Russia. And I think he's an incredibly brave and cultured individual, and doing exactly what the BBC is set up to do. It's something that provides. It's supposed to provide balance. The BBC is closely monitored by the government, particularly during heightened periods of tension, though direct intervention in editorial matters is less frequent. The BBC's coverage of the IRA campaign in Northern Ireland was contentious, and the broadcaster faced criticism from both the British government and the Irish nationalists. The BBC had restrictions placed on it by the government on what could be broadcast, such as the 1988 broadcasting ban that prevented the voices of Sinn Féin from being heard, but the BBC got round it by getting actors to voice their words, which is a very strange period of time. But accusations from both sides persisted. And impartiality today has evolved into the changes in society, advances in media, three concepts: balance and fairness, ensuring all significant viewpoints are represented. Due weight giving appropriate coverage to viewpoints based on their significance and their prevalence in communities in the UK. Diversity, covering a broad range of perspectives, including those from minority or marginalised groups. So there is clarity within the BBC system about how it understands impartiality, and it clings to it quite seriously. But it's still got a chairman and a director general appointed by the government. And while these appointments are meant to safeguard the BBC's independence, there have been instances where perceived government influence raises concerns about impartiality. And both the appointments and the funding. As a publicly funded body, the BBC must navigate pressures from the government regarding its budget and financial accountability, which can indirectly affect editorial independence. And this concept of impartiality is therefore tested by these aspects, by a greater attempt to define what impartiality is, or how it's understood, or how it's presented, and also by the rise of social media, the fragmentation of the media audiences, the increased political polarisation. So within that scope, the BBC's commitment to impartiality remains, but it's continually adapting, and the word impartiality may not mean quite what it means today, in the same way that it meant something in 1927. That word has changed. That word's understanding has changed, and the importance is to recognise that even in 1927, and certainly today, the concept of due impartiality is very different to strict neutrality. Due impartiality means to take views from different sides. Strict neutrality means not to take sides, not to listen, really, I think. Due impartiality means to listen and to respond. And also to learn. So, for example, the BBC now feels quite comfortable stating that climate change deniers don't need to be given equal airtime in discussions about the climate change. The BBC has moved on. But it's not moved on when it comes to republicanism. And so the Republican movement received a huge amount of publicity during the coronation, because that was the alternative narrative, a narrative which is almost unheard. And Not My King became quite a fashionable concept. Tim Davie, when he was appointed the BBC Director General in 2020, emphasised the importance of restoring trust in the BBC's impartiality, and his approach involves navigating this sort of complex issue where impartiality is perceived differently by different people. The Stonewall diversity scheme, for example, the internal conflicts. There's a very interesting book by a man called Tom Mills. It's actually more of a pamphlet or an extended article called The BBC, The Myth of a Public Service. And it argues that the BBC's independence and impartiality is more complex than has been publicly acknowledged. And he states the BBC will aim to fairly and accurately reflect the balance of opinion amongst elites. And in that respect, it's no different from any other reputable media organisation. But a number of studies suggest that the range of opinion on the BBC is narrower than some of its rivals. Interesting. Mills takes the view that the BBC's impartiality is shaped by its political context, with senior figures influenced by their need to negotiate with the government over funding and regulations. And he highlights that while the BBC maintains some level of editorial autonomy, it's not free from political influence. He says that the BBC is not independent in a substantive sense, emphasises its formal accountability to government ministers who set operational terms, appoint senior figures, determine the licence fee. He says the BBC has always been formally accountable to ministers for its operations. Governments set the terms under which it operates. They appoint the most senior figures and they set the level of the licence fee, which is the BBC's major source of income. And I think there's a difference between a discussion about the BBC's impartiality and a discussion about whether or not the BBC should be receiving money from a licence fee, and whether not paying that licence fee is a criminal offence. The structural dependence on the government undermines claims by the BBC to true independence, but a structural dependence on advertising would equally undermine claims to true independence. Mills says that while politicians have generally granted editorial autonomy, the BBC remains under political control and pressure, and is often described historically as remote state control. So this autonomy is therefore ambiguous and contingent, and at any moment the government could presumably push a button and demand obeisance. And the BBC's editorial policy is heavily influenced by its need to negotiate periodically with the government over crucial aspects like funding and its charter, as we saw under the control of Nadine Dorries. Regarding its editorial independence, Mills explains that while direct government interference may not be overt, editorial policy is defined at the top of the BBC, a highly politicised section due to its interactions with the government. And this policy then trickles down through the organisation in complex ways. What happens is the editorial policy is defined at the top of the BBC, and that policy then cascades down the hierarchy in rather complex and uneven ways, he says. This hierarchical influence means that the editorial decisions are not free from external pressures, contrary to what Laura Quensberg, in her sort of flagship Sunday morning show, might assert. Her claim of dying in a ditch for the impartiality of the BBC is therefore more rhetorical than factual, more rhetorical than real. Mills says that the BBC's working definition of impartiality, suggesting that it aligns more closely with reflecting elite opinions rather than the broader perspective of the broader spectrum of perspectives. He says the BBC will aim to fairly and accurately reflect the balance of opinion amongst elites. The range of opinion on the BBC is narrower than some of its rivals. So it's a middle-class thing, in other words. And he supports this by pointing out studies that show that the BBC gave more airtime to certain viewpoints, such as opponents of Jeremy Corbyn, compared to other broadcasters like Channel 4 News. Using the Gilligan affair, I knew his family. Mills highlights the complexities of the BBC's relationship with the government. The BBC's initial firm stance against the Blair government's false claims about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction and the subsequent forced resignations of its chair and director general illustrate the political pressures it faces. Mills again, the Iraq War was another area where scholarly research found that the BBC was more favourable to the government and its supporters compared with other broadcasters. And this incident underscores the BBC's susceptibility to political influence and challenges the narrative of its independence. Mills says that John Burt's tenure heralded a neoliberal shift at the BBC, focusing on stronger editorial controls and a business-friendly orientation. Burt was an out-and-out neoliberal who wanted to radically shift the institutional structure and culture away from its statist character to a more neoliberal, business-friendly direction. This shift indicates how external political and economic ideologies can reshape the BBC's internal dynamics and editorial policies. So a future vision of the BBC is really what is being debated at the moment, and Tom Mills, I imagine, is essential reading for anyone who's involved in that debate. He advocates the elimination of political control mechanisms and the institution of a more democratic process. He calls for an ambitious vision for public media that addresses current social crises and embodies democratic values. Well, that's just it's just words, isn't it? What kind of BBC do we want for the 21st century? That's the real question we should be asking. If we want public media to survive, we are going to have to come up with a vision for the future. His critique of the BBC reveals a complex interplay between government influence, editorial autonomy, internal hierarchical pressures, those three things alone compete against the concept of due impartiality and independence and neutrality, whatever terms you want. My own understanding is that the impartiality is predicated on opposition to whichever government happens to be in power. That's a sort of quick benchmark. His reimagined vision for public media underscores the need for structural reforms that ensure true independence and democratic accountability, but it should spread. And in the past, the vision and the influence of the BBC is something that has spread. And it should spread, I think, to the smaller channels, encouraging, like manure, encouraging small, younger things to grow, like GB News, like LBC, like Talk TV, though that's now sort of died its death and it's gone into the YouTube stratosphere. Nothing wrong with YouTube, but you know, the real work is being done outside in these organizations, in these pseudo-independent organizations, and they need to be encouraged. They need to be encouraged in professionalism and independence. But where the BBC feels constrained by the idea of impartiality from expressing opinions, I think these other channels should be defined by their opinion. And it gives you an opportunity. Here's what the BBC says, often tardy, often cautious. Here's what somebody else who's got their finger on the button of the event, and immediately you get a response. I think we need that range of news broadcasting, whether we call it entertainment or we call it news. I don't think it really matters, except it should be entertaining, and a news program should be based on that sort of magazine structure, which is so beautifully exemplified by the structure of BBC Blue Peter, for example, and which is so undermined by the rather dull, repetitive structure of breakfast television. And what we need is a variety show. Actually, what we need is something like the music hall, and that diversity of different forms of presentation. One of the things that gives me a lot of hope is Butterworth's presence in GB News, somebody who is left of centre in a right of centre broadcasting channel. That I think is very positive, and I'm sure you could find similar instances in LBC. Rachel Johnson is perhaps quite a good example there. But we don't want. It doesn't need to be monolithic. It just needs to be the news filtered through opinion. And I don't think it's possible. I know Maya Tusi has this idea that you do news and then you do opinion. I don't think that's possible. I think the news comes through the opinionated bias, and no matter how much one tries very hard to be completely independent. Francis Bacon, I think, was Francis Bacon, who's the father of modern science, scientific thinking. Anyway, he said, "Hitherto, truth has come from authority. We get our truth by looking to the Pope for approval. Now, authority comes with truth." But I think the news lies somewhere between those two. And the news, and certainly opinion, lies in that place where we can correct ourselves, and where we can say one thing one day and quite another thing another day. And in intelligence is about reading between, is about the ability to discern, and that comes with trying out the different levers. And we come back to this thing that I mentioned right at the beginning, how words change their meaning, and things change their identity. So I am very much aware that I'm coming very close to being on a list. I think I had a job in Russia a few years ago, and theoretically I still have it. And I was moved from being a professor in the Department of Education, which was the main thrust of my university, to being the professor of theology, which was rather exciting. But in no time at all, COVID was on us, and equally, I was slightly overexposed in a reality TV show called The Circle, and I was advised it would be foolish to go back at this moment, partly because I had a fairly high profile identity, and I might have attracted the wrong sort of attention, and I've never quite known. At one point, I was told I was a professor emeritus. Another point, I was still a professor. At one point, somebody's even told me I'm an honorary professor. And it is extraordinary when you've been doing a job to find that your job is sort of, that the rug is pulled from under you. But I haven't gone back, and I certainly don't intend to go back while this present regime is in control in the Kremlin, and I certainly don't intend to keep my mouth shut. But the revisionism, I'm sure, will continue. And the same thing is true about the BBC. When you've got a word like impartial, it can change its meaning subtly depending on how it's used. So impartial doesn't necessarily mean impartial today in the same way that it did in 1927. And you have to ask, what was the issue? Why did the BBC Charter of 1927 decree due impartiality? Because it wanted to make sure that the BBC was not over-influenced by the government of the day. Today we have so many issues over which we need to be, quote, impartial. And I'm not convinced it's possible. So although I think the ambition, perfection is the aim, we have to admit that is not something we will ever achieve. Impartiality might be something we strive for, but we must recognise we will fail. And I think for people who don't have the resources of the BBC, we should simply recognise that that a readiness to change our mind, a readiness to offer one opinion today and another opinion tomorrow, is not a sign of being hypocritical or confused, though I think I am in a state of confusion all the time. It's a matter of being human. To be human is to be confused. To be human is to be constantly putting our foot into the river and realising it's changed. It's changed, and what I thought was real today is not real tomorrow.